Hi, everyone, and we are here with Kunal Purohit on Harper podcast. He's the author of H Pop, a journalist with more than 2 decades of experience. Kunal, thank you so much for taking the time out to do this conversation. It's great to have you here.
It's an absolute pleasure, Amrita. I mean, as I said, we've I think our paths have sometimes sort of crossed in different ways, but it's great to finally be in conversation with you after all of these years.
Yes, I feel the same way. And, I'm, of course, also following your Twitter. I've been on the sort of sidelines, keeping track of your journey in a way as a former journalist. So we are here to talk about a really very important book. It's an intense book. You have your coffee, you're set. You're going to give us the next several minutes. We're going to dive straight in. For those of you who are listening and haven't yet read Kunal's book, H Pop, the subtitle is The Secretive World of Hindutva Pop Stars. So obviously we will give you a warning because it is not for the faint of heart. I think, Kunal, you went into this with your eyes open. I wanted to ask you a little bit about really the genesis of this book, because, in the introduction itself, you kind of tell your readers that this was not an area you had explored before, and you kind of almost fell into your lap in a way, but you had to keep, digging deeper. So tell us a little bit maybe about how this book really came to be.
I mean, I think it's one of those beautiful things about journalism, right, Amrita? Because you've been there, you know this. You go out looking for one story, and then you end up stumbling upon something very different by the end of it. This was one such sort of instance where I had been doing, for a number of months by then, I'd been doing some sustained work around trying to understand the genesis of hate crimes in the country. And if you remember, there was this phase where, especially so, there were repeated instances of mob lynchings. There were repeated instances of, assault on members of one community by sort of right-wing groups from another. So, there was all of that happening. And as a journalist, I was going to villages, I was going to different places in states like Uttar Pradesh, in states like Jharkhand. And I'm just trying to sort of capture two things largely. Not just the instance, because that had already been captured by sort of the reporting that comes immediately, but the sort of, the process before the hate crime, before the instance, and the afterlife of the instance, right? So typically what happened, which led to the hate crime, and then what happens after the hate crime. So it's in this reporting that I really sort of stumbled upon something that I constantly believed we were not looking at as a society, which was the process before, right? The process that was leading up to the hate crime. Because I think sometimes we tend to look at these as events and as sort of isolated instances, not realizing that there's always a build-up that has led to these events. So the violence is always an outcome of a process. It's not the sort of the event in itself that we tend to look at. And it's in that journey that I realized that there was this sort of it's ironic, but there was a silent sort of genre of popular culture that was emerging, and that was possibly slowly driving people more and more to the edge when it came to religious fundamentalism, and sort of when it came to pushing people away from each other by slowly polarizing them on the basis of their religion and identity. And so that is how I really stumbled upon it, and I talk about it in the book as well. Of this place in Jharkhand called Gumla, where I had gone to report a hate crime, and then when I tried to sort of reconstruct the events of that hate crime on the day the hate crime happened, I realized that the actual instance had a lot to do with the Ram Navami procession that was going on in that town, and some of the people who were actually involved in the hate crime were participants in the Ram Navami procession, and that procession was extremely controversial because of the music that they played. They come right outside the mosque and they play a song which sort of translates to Mulle ki topi gira do, which is to knock the skull cap off the cleric's head. So that kind of religious fervor in the procession, then in a few hours leads to the lynching of a 20-year-old Muslim boy from that same town. So I try to understand the chronology of these instances, And I realized that this was a pattern that was repeatedly sort of being seen in different places. So just in Jharkhand, which was actually by then the second most dangerous, sort of state in the country when it came to religion-based hate crimes, I saw that in Jharkhand, this was a bit of a pattern where every time there was a Ramnami procession, every time there was a communal incident which polarized communities, there was a role that music had played. Music was being played outside mosques, sometimes outside, Muslim localities. And the music was rather provocative in a way that it would almost always polarize communities. And so that is honestly what led me to, sort of diving deeper into this whole phenomena. And just trying to understand what is this music, because I'd never heard of this music before, but also who are the people who are creating the music? What is it that motivates them? What is it that drives them? And what does this economy look like? Who are these pop stars? So that's essentially how the book was born, and which is why I call it the secretive world of Hindutva pop stars, because it is, in some ways, it is hidden in plain sight, right? It's there, but you don't really see it. You don't really understand that these are not isolated sort of artists who are just singing these one-off songs. When you dive deeper, you understand the larger industry that functions and how it does tie in with sometimes the ruling party, but also sometimes the state, and when it comes to sort of different regional governments and so on. So that is essentially how I stumbled upon the book, Amrita.
And AIDS pop is a very catchy term for very chilling phenomenon. I think the way you describe it is, clearly for someone like me who also had no idea about this, it's an entire ecosystem, as you're telling us as well right now. We're gonna, try and play some clips. You have lyrics in your, that you've also written out. So there are many strands to pick up, out of what you just said, Kunal. I do want to ask you though, you've sort of framed the narrative of this book through three main characters, and then you've obviously done a lot of interviews and a lot of background research. Not to nerd out on that part, but just to ask you a little bit about how did you decide that was going to be the vehicle, the narrative vehicle? How did you even gain their trust, and how did you shortlist these as your main characters and sort of the archetypes through which you approach this huge subject?
So, as I said, when I first started off, my journey really began with music as sort of the main genre of popular culture, which I thought was weaponized and was leading to all of this. But then when I was trying to dive deeper in and dig more about this, I realized that the story doesn't really end at music. Music seemed like the most visible, the most sort of glamorous of them all. But there were different forms of popular culture that were being weaponized. And so that really gave me the, sort of the more umbrella conceptual theme around the book, which is the weaponization of popular culture in today's India. So then when I started looking at what other forms were being weaponized, I realized that apart from music, there was also poetry, which, a lot of us in the Swiss city don't realize is still a very crucial part of the entertainment apparatus when it comes to the rural and the semi-rural. So the Kavi Sammelans, the Mushairas, they're still a very integral part of how rural communities get their entertainment and their sort of sense of live entertainment events, because the concerts in these places look very different. The poetry recitals look very different and very different from what you and I possibly experience. So poetry, I realized, was the other, sort of popular culture genre. And the third in this series was publishing, was the act of actually bringing out books, which really essentially was, really talking about the Hindutva agenda, validating and legitimizing a lot of the themes around Hindutva, a lot of the conspiracies that the Hindu right wing believes in, and then sort of trying to, solidify some of the biases that the ideology has always carried forward. So for instance, its inimical relationship with Muslims. All these three forms of popular culture were common in their sort of motivation, that they were all aimed at Muslims. They were all targeting Muslims in different forms, stoking different conspiracies about how Muslims were here to outnumber Hindus. They were waging a secret war against the Hindus. Muslim men were out to lure Hindu women and so on. So there was this sort of common strand of all of these three, essentially dealing with and peddling Islamophobia as one of its main sort of currencies, if we could call it that. So that was one common theme that I saw among all three. There were also other themes. For instance, there was this, especially within poetry and publishing, this essential theme to really recast history, historical characters and historical events in a light that is very convenient and which fits in very well with the Hindutva, way of thinking. So one of the prime examples that you see in this popular culture genre is this constant, sort of targeting of Mahatma Gandhi, for instance, characterizing him as the villain of Hindus, and as someone who was an appeaser of the Muslims, who was actually a stooge and an agent of the Muslims, really. So that kind of recasting of someone like Mahatma Gandhi, throwing out the values that he stood for, really trying to give it a very different spin. His legacy was constantly being undermined. So you saw a series of these events also happening when it came to these popular culture genres. So for instance, one of the characters in the book, Kamal Agne, who is the poet, his pet poem and sort of the poem that really catapulted him to fame is this 14 minute long poem on Gandhi. And Amrita, it essentially talks of how the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi was not just justified, but was deeply, deeply necessary. The last couple of lines of his poem are saying, "Agar Godse ki goli utri na hoti सीने में, हर हिंदू पढ़ता नमाज फिर मक्का और मदीने में." So it really looks at Gandhi in a very, very different light from what you and I have looked at all of our lives. And so I felt that these all three were, even if publishing was not as glamorous as, say, music or poetry, I felt that this was a larger phenomena that had to be documented at this point. And just to respond to your question about the reason why I chose three people, I felt that structurally, I think it would make more sense to follow the story of one person and then, use that as a narrative technique to be able to offer a window into that world, rather than look at just multiple figures. Because I think as journalists, we tend to do that. We tend to look at multiple examples of a certain phenomena. But then when you write a book, you'd want it to be a much more sort of immersive experience. So what I would want the reader to know is also know the person very well, not just their art, but also the artist very deeply, right? So you sort of also understand them. And I think that it also comes with this, with this belief that I have that in these polarized times, especially, I think there is a broader need to understand each other at a human level, rather than just demonize each other because our political philosophies or our ideologies don't match. So one attempt was also to be able to give people such an in-depth look into some of these, into the lives of some of these artists, that you, at one level, you also understand what they're doing at a human level, even though at a political level you disagree completely, but you're able to see the human motivations that drive them. So that was a very conscious call that I took very early on in the book.
And I think, it really does come across, because I do feel like, we get to know Kavi Singh so well. And so the three characters are Kavi Singh, Kamal Agne, Sandeep Deo, as Kunal was saying, looking at it from poetry, music, publishing, and storytelling. We're going to get into a little bit about how, of course, social platforms have enabled this mass, hundreds of millions of, views that you talk about. But coming back to the humanizing, it's really interesting to see how you are able to, showcase that side of, for example, even relationship splintering, right? In the case of Kavi Singh, you don't see that coming when in essentially that part one, but when you come back to see what's happened to their journey, I do want to ask you a little bit, and this is of course the art and craft of your entire career as a journalist and a storyteller. It is also how you've been able to get access and gain trust. Can you take us through a little bit about how that worked for you? Was there some resistance or sort of hesitation at first, or were you able to build those human connections quite quickly?
So, ironically, I mean, that also became one of the key motivators for me to be able to write this book, is that none of these three characters had ever found any coverage in the English media. So when I first approached them, Amrita, the first question they asked me is, why do you want to do this? Because, we've never been covered by the English media. We've never been written about. So why is this journalist, coming all the way from Mumbai and wanting to spend time with us and wanting to write about our work? And so I think that was also one factor which I realized, I think, more and more, that their story needs to be told. So I think that was the initial suspicion that they had in their minds. And essentially, there's also, this sort of barrier that I speak about, right? Where people, it's almost like a different world there, as against the world that, people in the cities, for instance, in the metros inhabit, and the pop culture that we consume is so different from the pop culture that they create, and that people, just a couple of hours of drive from Delhi or Mumbai will be consuming. So, there was also bridging that gap in their understanding. So I had to really break it down and tell them what really is my earnest sort of motivation for the book, which was that, while they may be popular in those parts of the country, while they might command a following of, millions of people, they're still relatively, or at least they were still relatively unknown in the world that I was a part of, in the world that maybe you and me are a part of. So I told them that it was the need of the hour to be able to tell their story to a wider audience, in the hope that we all understand how our country is changing, because I think increasingly we're not able to have that conversation anymore. So essentially, it was that conversation that I had to have with them. Some of them were easier to convince. Some of them were slightly more skeptical, and as a result of which, I think the process took the time that it took, which is 4 years. It took me 4 years from the time that I made that first conversation to then finishing my manuscript, and it took me 4 years of constantly being in touch with them, constantly going back to them, traveling with them sometimes, visiting their families, visiting them in their village, and so on. So it was a lot of that. It was being a part of their lives through these 4 years, and also being able to see the country through their eyes for these 4 years, which was very rich for me in terms of, just being able to understand what their worldview was, and how is it that they were seeing the need for the pop culture that they were creating. So I think the time taken to write this book was also essential, because without this kind of time, I wouldn't have been able to build that relationship with them. And I think as journalists, this is something that we don't always get to do, which is to spend a lot of time with the people we want to write about. So I was very keen that I didn't want to, be that typical journalist who does a book like this in a year. I wanted it to be, something of an immersive experience, not just for the reader, but for me to begin with.
Yeah, and that authenticity really comes through. So you're not like para dropping in and then you're done. the usual unfortunate, I guess limitations if it was just a story that you were going for. But I do want to ask you a little bit about that human connection, because of course you're also, as you're documenting this, you're experiencing firsthand, and there's no two ways about the H or the hate part of the let's say the poetry or the rendition or the singing. You've also documented the small H, the humanistic part, what's happening behind the scenes. And I think it's really fascinating also to see where, there are these expectations that there will be some sort of political quid pro quo, and then there's disappointment when there isn't in some cases. And that's also fascinating. But your reactions in the moment when you're there witnessing this as you document what are hate-filled renditions, let's say, how are you able to sort of manage that and manage your own reactions in a sort of on a more fundamental human level, I suppose?
I think, I was very clear right at the onset that this book shouldn't be about me at all. In fact, one of the earliest conversations that I had with Swati Chopra, my fantastic editor on the book, was that I don't want to have a voice in the book. I don't want there to be an I in the book at all, saying I think this and I think that, because I wanted this book to be a book of reportage. Didn't want it to be a book of my opinion being thrust. And I think that comes very easy to us in the days of Twitter and all of that, right? Where we are very, very quick to give our opinions out. I was very clear that I didn't want to, sort of have my ideological affinities cast a shadow on the book, or cast a shadow on the relationship that I was building with these subjects. So one of the things that I prepared myself for was that I will find myself in situations, in positions where I will not agree at all with a lot of what is being said. And I think as a reporter, you're trained to be in those situations also sometimes, right? Where the idea is not for you to be in agreement with everything your subject tells you, but essentially to come back, to your desk with a story to tell. So that was just really, and something that, you would also be able to relate. It was really just old-fashioned journalism where you keep yourself out of the story. It doesn't mean you don't have an opinion. So, for instance, it didn't mean that there were no points during the 4 years where I had a conversation with them, or where I had a disagreement with them on what they said. Right? There were a lot of those moments where I would disagree, where I would where I would question them, where I would challenge them on a lot of their assumptions. But I was very clear that I could not ever let those enter the realm of being disputes. They could just be healthy disagreements, but they would have to be manageable in the sense that I didn't ever want them to, sort of be so upset with me, or I didn't want to get to a point where I was so upset with them that a conversation was not possible, because that really essentially defeats the purpose of the book. So I was very clear that the book was not going to be about me. The book was going to be about them, their stories, and what I said didn't really matter in front of, in front of the story that there is to tell. So I think that sort of belief helped me quite a bit during the process.
And that's fascinating because, this is the second time you're alluding to something that we see less and less of, right? Because, like when you talk about Twitter, for example, it's almost impossible to have a healthy disagreement. It's almost impossible to have these conversations. So the sort of dehumanizing that can happen on social media, you've kind of been able to circumnavigate through just a human-to-human connect. Do you feel that these are more critical than ever, given the state? And again, we're recording this actually before elections, but it is an election year. And you are documenting, as you said, the last 4 years, what has been slowly building up, but perhaps escaped the mainstream media, at least in English. Do you think that it's more critical than ever that we have access to differing points of view, sort of the unvarnished truths that old-fashioned reportage and books like this, stories like this?
100%, Amrita. I mean, I think increasingly so, not just in India, but we're seeing globally how polarized we're becoming as communities, right? Where we're not able to talk to each other, where we're not able to even relate to each other's concerns anymore. And the truth is that I think a lot of that has to do with the breakdown of the media. So, for instance, I, as an independent journalist, I mean, I had to struggle a lot to be able to be given the kind of budgets that are required to go to the field and be able to tell these stories. I know that most of the mainstream media doesn't do this anymore, right? When do you see a journalist from a television channel, for instance, travel in the middle of nowhere to a rural area and tell you these sort of stories about what is happening in the country, unless it's motivated by an event? So I'm very, very certain that I think we need a lot more of this, because essentially I think what has happened is we've lost that human connect with each other, where we demonize and villainize each other for the political views that we hold. And as a result of which, we're not able to even the legitimate concerns that the other would have, we're not able to see them anymore, because we're so clouded with our own judgments about things. And I mean, as you said, we're just a few weeks away from a new government. I don't know what is going to happen, but I can tell you that that Hindutva being the most dominant political ideology of the day is not something that you can turn the clock back on. If that has to happen, it might happen, gradually. It might happen over a period of time, but it's not going to be that you're going to go back, even if let's say the BJP doesn't come to power, which seems rather improbable. But even if that happens, you're not going to be able to suddenly go back to a different world, because the world has changed. The Hindu right wing has been extremely effective in being able to, make the messaging so accessible to people. They've been able to convince people that the kind of rhetoric that they employ is the rhetoric that people must connect to, because it talks very deeply to some of their fears, some of their sort of concerns, also some of their aspirations, right? So they've managed to make this a very, very potent mix of fear and aspiration, which is why the message is resonating so much. So be it the Ram temple, be it sort of this constant victimization, this constant villainization of Muslims, for instance. All of these have been concerns that have been constantly voiced in the Hindu right-wing ecosystem. As a result of which, what we're seeing is this broad consensus of sorts in the country around, even if it's not around the BJP or if it's not around the RSS, but it's around the themes that the BJP, the RSS, and the broader Hindu right wing constantly talks about. So that is what we're seeing. And if this is the country that we're now going to live in, and if the rules have changed, then I think it's increasingly important for us to understand this new country. It's increasingly important for us to understand why a substantial part of the country believes in the concerns that it does, or thinks of people a certain way, right? And so, which is why I believe that this kind of reporting is I would say, needed much more than ever at this point in our country.
No, I 100% I agree with you. I think that we haven't seen this kind of reporting, actually. That's what was also surprising, or maybe not surprising. The state of the media is another conversation at another time. I feel that, I want to come back to the social media point and what you were just saying, though. At the same time, so within this ecosystem, you also document how, for example, someone who's relatively unknown does this one viral video, and then realizes, okay, well, this is the way to get a lot more attention. There's, of course, so in the Kavi Singh case, there are people supporting behind, thinking through. There are things that don't work, which, of course, in many cases we would not hear about. You'll only see the very, very popular viral videos. There are people who are looking at literally the manifesto, I think the election manifesto, and saying, like you said, it'll be Article 370, it'll be the Ram Temple, and then saying we're going to create content around this and realizing that's going viral. There are people who are, it is like a social media playbook. Like there are people who are like, this is not working, so tweak the messaging. Can you double this?
It's not even that, right? So I think one of the sort of lazy assumptions around this pop culture and around broadly the conversations that the Hindu right-wing ecosystem has is that it's almost always top down, right? Where the agenda is set at the top by the party or by the RSS, and then the conversations around this start. Whereas the truth of the matter is, and again, this is something that we must understand, is that the ecosystem that they've created now is so self-sustaining in some ways also that a lot of the conversations start within that ecosystem. Right. So, for instance, the whole, I remember when I was reporting the book, if you remember, there was this whole conversation in UP about the need for a population control law, and UP CM Yogi Adityanath also goes and makes statements like that, right? So these are all, again, conversations that I had been tracking in the ecosystem, were happening for a while, for a couple of years. And of course, this is a larger sort of old demand of the Hindu right wing to have a law like that. But there was a momentum that was gaining within those circuits, which was not being seen anywhere in the media. It was not seen, it was not being reported on. But because I was part of these groups, I was a part of these communities where these conversations were ongoing, I knew that, people in say, a semi-rural town in UP were sort of doing these padyatras, going to the collector's office in different districts. They were writing to the prime minister. So all of that was happening at a level that you and I weren't being able to capture because the media doesn't really get to that point anyway. All right. So I think the conceptualization of what these conversations are and how they flow will also have to be redefined, where it's not always just the top-down approach, but because these ecosystems are so active and alert and constantly churning out content, there's also the conversation going from the bottom to the top. Right. So they also become very interesting feedback loops. Where they're telling the party apparatus that this is what is being spoken about, or these are the issues. So for instance, what happens is when there's a larger sort of decision that is announced by the governments, people like you and me might be very, very surprised at how it came about. But actually, in those ecosystems, those things have been on the agenda for many, many months or many years sometimes. But it's only that you and I get access to it only once they're announced. So we feel that the consensus building has been skipped, but actually the consensus building has been ongoing, and popular culture becomes a very crucial part of being able to build an informal sense of consensus around some of this.
And even build those pressure blocks. I feel like it's fascinating. You also document how in real time they're tailoring messaging, right? Because it's very quickly through that, the audience reaction when it's a live audience, through the reaction on social media. But there is a full content strategy. So the three main characters and their support base and their competitors, I suppose their peers, it's actually like a content strategy. It's actually marketing. It's a business. It's a business model.
Absolutely. I mean, Look, they're very clear that, in fact, Kavi Singh, who's the singer in the book, and her father Ramkesh. I remember there was this time when they also told me how they think of themselves like journalists. They think that they are like journalists in this new age of information. Because remember that most people in India now, when something happens, they like in the old days, they would go onto Google and search for it. Now they're doing that on YouTube. So YouTube essentially, and there's data to prove this. YouTube is essentially now the search engine of the internet users of the country. So for all of these pop stars who are creating this popular culture, it's also very important for them to be doing this in real time, right? So for instance, when Article 370 was abrogated, and if you remember the first day, this was in the Rajya Sabha, that Home Minister Amit Shah actually moves the amendment. Just the same night when this happens, the same night, there is a song that Kavi and her father work on through the night, and by the next morning when he walks into the Lok Sabha, the song is already on YouTube, right? And before Article 370 has actually officially even been abrogated by both houses, the song is already out, and the song essentially is giving its audience a sort of a narrative to think about, right? It's essentially telling you what you need to know about Article 370, which is really captured by one line in that song, which says, "Ab Kashmir ki ghati mein Jai Shri Ram kinare gunjenge." Right? So you don't need to get bothered with any of the other details about what it's going to do or what. This is essentially the narrative that you, as a follower of the Hindu right wing, or as a Hindu in this country, must be bothered with, which is that now, Sri Ram has now reached the Kashmir Valley. This sort of awareness that this is how quick their turnaround times have to be is this is not the work of someone who doesn't know how the internet works. This is the work of an internet genius almost, right? So there's that kind of awareness that has also entered into these realms. I mean, they're aware of what the algorithms do. They're aware of how quick the content has to be, how short the content has to be. So what also happens is they now see the different additions to these platforms. So for instance, they knew of YouTube, but then when YouTube Shorts came, they had to start repackaging their songs. They had to start repackaging their poetry to be able to convert them into very attractive looking shorts, right? And the same with Instagram Reels. So they're very well aware of how they need to constantly repackage and then sometimes also recycle their information so as to be able to grab their audiences in the way that the audiences want them to be grabbed. So if there's a younger audience who's now consuming mostly Reels and sort of Instagram, these guys are very quick to move platforms and now go to Instagram. Till a few years ago, I remember when I first started off reporting, most of them thought Facebook was the base. But now they're all focusing on Instagram as sort of their fundamental platform, apart from YouTube, where a lot of the monetization happens. So there's a great awareness, Amrita, and I think we are a mistake if we think that there isn't in
awareness. And I think also when you talk about the monetization, they're keeping track of that. They're getting lots of viewer comments and engagement. It's a very sophisticated sort of digital native approach to something I think that was not very clear at this level, at least. It's the first time.
Agencies, Amrita, that are helping them. There are agencies. For instance, Kavi Singh, by the end of my reporting with her, she had actually got an agency to help her with everything. So they would tell her, the kind of tags that would work. They would tell her the kind of packaging that would work for her content. So there's also professional support. If you do get better and better, and if you have the privilege, there's also professional support that you can get. Kamal has an agency which helps him, sort of package his stuff and things. So there's also professional help there.
It's fascinating. It's like it's really a bird's eye view into an entire industry, like an entire ecosystem. I do want to ask you a little bit about reactions you've gotten so far. Have your protagonists been in touch with you since the book came out? Have they been curious about the reactions? What have you been hearing?
I mean, they have. So, I mean, they were one of the first few people to read the book when it came out. A couple of them really have nothing very critical to say. They did accept that, that I had. This was essentially a bit of a critique of their work. because their work does come out to be targeting a certain community, to be targeting a certain set of individuals. But I think by the end of it, they said, this is your right as the author, but at least you've represented us in our entirety, in terms of the facts around our life, in terms of just what our fears and our motivations are. So that's largely been the reaction. Although one of them did feel that he was sort of characterized rather unfairly as somewhat of a Muslim hater, as someone who has problems with Muslims and with Islam. But he said he doesn't have any such issues with them at all. Although some of the statements that he made on record when we were interviewing were quite the contrary. But I mean, look, I think some of them are bound to feel that way, because when you read about yourself in a certain way, it just stands out so much more than someone else criticizing you. And often I think these artists also live in a bit of a closed feedback loop mechanism, where they're not really hearing from an audience which is very critical of their work. They're essentially growing among audiences which favor their work. So they're also not used to sort of that sense of that lens of critique, which the book does employ on them. So there's been that, but there's been, I mean, I was expecting there to be sort of the targeting by certain individuals, by people in the Hindu right wing. So there's been that. But there's, for instance, there was this whole thing where when the book came out, a lot of the trolls who often attack me on Twitter and other platforms, they all descended on the Amazon page listing of the page. So if you, and sort of overnight, the book's rating fell from a 5 or whatever to a 1. And then all of them started posting reviews saying this is a terrible book, please don't buy it. And funny, none of them were, there's that verified customer tag. None of them were verified customers, but that's okay. I think that's a part of the game. I mean, but what I would want to mention is it's a bit sad that what I did experience in Delhi this time was that, a cultural center like the IIC, where we were supposed to host the event, very suspiciously at the last minute, just a few days before the launch, decided to cancel our event. And didn't give us really didn't give us any reasons, in fact, for the cancellation of the event. So, there is also that there are platforms, there are people who don't want to be talking about the book, who don't want to be associated with the book. Sometimes you have to face that, because writing a book like this in these times comes at a bit of a cost, and I mean, I'm quite well aware of those costs. But nonetheless, I mean, I'm thrilled at the number of people who've read the book, at the number of people who've written to me. So it's always very heartening to see that. And I've also been traveling with the book, Amrita, and going to different cities. And again, very, very heartwarming to see the number of people who care about what's happening to the country, right? Sometimes these things can be very isolating, because I was living with this subject for 4 years. And then when you finally get out with it, you see that people do care. People do want to make a difference. They want to see a different India than what it is right now. So that is a heartwarming sign for sure.
And also, I think people want to know these stories. I think what you've done is also, it is a gift, and obviously a mixed bag in terms of how people can weaponize social, which is also so ironic given the subject matter. With Amazon rating. So hopefully your readers will go on Amazon now and rate this highly. I'm sure I'm going to make a note.
Fingers crossed.
But I think people, increasingly there's two things I want to pick up from what you just said. One is there is this general paranoia, I feel now, that, we don't want to say things that are too controversial. We don't want to get, involved. So, platforms not hosting or, even doing an interview like this. I mean, I've been at the receiving end of trolling and backlash and legal stuff, and you have to think twice, saying like, listen, do you really want to put yourself out there? What you've done in this book, I think, is very brave. So I think it's brave also of your protagonist to speak to you so openly when you're not from that closed ecosystem. So I think there is courage there on both sides. Hats off to you and to them. And what you said about them also, it's so interesting. It's for everybody. All of us now are in these closed feedback loops. We don't talk to. Coming back to this thing of conversation, do you think you have, of course, flagged some concerns? But do you think this has also expanded your worldview in a way that you might not have predicted? Are there any reactions you've had that have surprised you?
100%, Amrita. And I think one of the things, and I also do this in the book, that's just helped me also maybe evolve a bit more is in trying to have more empathy for people around me, and especially around the kind of contentious political subjects that you and I sort of look at when we are on social media and things. um, I think all of us are driven by our aspirations, by our fears, but also sometimes our experiences firsthand. So one of the things that I did understand when I was doing this book is just how much of our own lives shape our political views going on, right? And how much of our own experiences. So for instance, all of them, in fact, and I've made it a point to do this in the book, is that I've made it a point to go back to their early childhoods. I've made it a point to look at their early lives and just try and understand what I call the point of radicalization. What is that moment where they realized that that they were finally coming to accept, or maybe they were embracing the Hindu right wing ideology. And it's so fascinating to see that actually that point of radicalization comes from first hand experiences where, for instance, for a Kamal Agne, the poet in the book, it comes from feeling very betrayed at a very deeply personal level by a Muslim friend of the family, right? And I don't want to get into the details of it because I hope that people read it. But it comes from an experience like that for him, where he felt so betrayed by what they did that he started sort of harboring these feelings towards that particular family which wronged him. But then when he gets in touch with the Hindu right wing outfits, they convince him that his personal trauma is actually not personal, but it's actually symptomatic of what Muslims do to Hindus, right? That sense of betrayal was weaponized by them and was exploited by them to draw him into their fold. So he has a very compelling reason to feel a certain way about a bunch of people, but they made it, they made it about the entire religion. So he came from a place of vulnerability, and I think that is essential to understand. It's essential to not, to sort of to dehumanize, to villainize people who don't speak our language, who don't believe in maybe the same values that you and I believe in, because they might have compelling reasons. I mean, I'm not condoning at all for a minute the hateful rhetoric or the hateful work, but I think the way out of this is not going to be through demonizing or villainizing them. I think the way out of this is to be able to understand why these rhetorics were resonating with people, and then try and create an antidote of sorts for that kind of rhetoric, right? But not by villainizing them. For instance, if there is a whole sort of narrative that is against Mahatma Gandhi, if there is this whole sort of creation of a narrative against Nehru, Pandit Nehru, then where are the voices which remind us of their legacy? Where are the voices which keep Mahatma Gandhi's legacy alive, and which sort of tell a younger and younger audience how relevant his work and his words are, even in this time and day. Because we've not been able to do that. There is a void in terms of the understanding around such people and such characters, and that void has then been utilized by the Hindu right wing very effectively to push its messaging. So rather than attack the people who are doing that, let's try and address that void that exists. And when we do that, we'll realize that we're able to set so many of these narratives right. But unfortunately, we've gone the wrong way, where we're just only in this space where we're fighting with each other in these WhatsApp groups, where our biggest form of rebellion is that we walk out of a WhatsApp group if there are people who post a certain message, or that it can't end there. We've got to think beyond these tiny battles that we're fighting.
And the rehumanizing, I mean, that's such a requirement. I mean, this that you put it so well. The other thing that strikes me is that we haven't really thought about how powerful pop culture is. I think in terms of the hold that it has, what you're talking about throughout this book. So again, hope everyone gets to read this. Let me wind our interview down for the moment. Kunal, I ask you a little bit about your influences. Who are some of the writers you loved reading? Who are you reading right now? Are there any recommendations you'd like to give?
I mean, that list is very long. As you see, there's a whole bookshelf right behind me, and it's a very difficult one to really sort of pinpoint. But Um, I'd say Revati Lal, The Anatomy of Hate. If people haven't read, it's a book very similar in its themes, where it does some fantastic deep dive narrative reporting around the lives of people. And I don't want to reveal much, but around the lives of people who most of us wouldn't be able to see eye to eye with, right? But in trying to understand and trying to humanize some of them and understand their motivations, it's a fantastic book. There is Catherine Boo's Beyond the Beautiful Forevers, which again does such a fantastic job of humanizing people who are around us and yet who are so sort of away from our eyesight and our eye line. So there are a couple of books that I've always and always sort of valued very deeply. But in terms of the books that I'm reading, I have a terrible habit, which is that I read multiple books at one go. So I read about 4 or 5 books. And sometimes it's very frustrating because I end up not finishing any of them. And then I sort of go through the parts that I feel are relevant. And most of this is reading for my work. So when I'm done with the relevant parts, I move on. But I am reading Christoph Jaffenot's Modi's India, which is a fantastic book again. So I would recommend all of these 3 books very, very highly.
Thank you so much. We part ways there because I can only read a book at a time. It's driving me insane. I'm doing a course. We have to read excerpts from different books, and it's actually, I think, frying my brain. So I think that is where we part ways.
I wouldn't recommend it at all. I wouldn't recommend it at all. I mean, I'm
It's
feeling myself away from it because I think it's also tempting, right? When you work in a space where there's books all around you, you want to pick up all of these books and keep reading bits and pieces of, but not a habit I recommend.
Thank you so much, Kunal, for taking the time and for writing this incredible book, Age Pop. I definitely hope you get more readers and more of those reviews that we were talking about. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Amrita. What a pleasure to talk to you.